4:11 a.m., April 23, 2026. Brewster County, Texas, 51 miles south of Marathon, deep in the Chihuahuan Desert backcountry. 12 FBI tactical agents and 6 ATF special response operators moved through absolute darkness in 2 file columns. No radio traffic, no flashlights, night vision monoculars only. The temperature had dropped to 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind pushed grit across the hardpan in long, low sheets. The target, a fenced compound on an abandoned ranching lease, sat in a shallow basin between 2 desert ridgelines, invisible from any paved road and designed to avoid satellite detection. 3 men were inside. One of them had been chained to a welded ring on the floor of a buried steel water tank for 36 days. Retention. Checkpoint. 00 hook. Viewer dropped into the breach before any context. Plant question. Who is inside, and how did agents find this place? The agents knew the tank existed because a woman in Midland had filed 11 police reports after every agency she contacted classified her husband as a voluntary missing person. Because a Customs and Border Protection surveillance drone on a routine smuggling sweep caught a thermal signature on April 8th that had no business existing on a dead grazing lease. And because an ATF intelligence analyst working a stolen explosives case noticed coordinates that 2 federal investigations had nearly missed each other by 72 hours. 3 separate leads, 1 compound, 1 hatch. What they found inside. Retention. Checkpoint. 030 resolution Ts. 3 independent threads. 1 compound. 36 days. Diego Marrero was 34 years old. Married. 2 children in Midland. Ages 7 and 4. He worked as a derrick hand for a small Permian Basin drilling contractor based out of Pecos, a third-tier outfit running 2 rigs on perpetual budget shortfalls, equipment certifications that didn't always get renewed on schedule, the kind of operation where the bit kept turning and nobody asked too many questions about how it stayed that way. Marrero had held that rotation for 2.5 years. 6 days on, 2 off, consistent and reliable, one of the better hands the company employed. March 18, 2026, was the start of his Thursday relief shift. He never arrived. His pickup was found that same evening at a truck stop on a frontage road 40 miles south of the rig, a fuel and food stop off Highway 67 that served long-haul traffic running the Presidio corridor. The truck was locked, keys on the seat. His phone was gone. His lunchbox, still packed for the shift, sat undisturbed on the passenger floor. The Brewster County Sheriff's Office responded. Deputies ran his name. Nothing came back. No outstanding warrants. No priors. His crew supervisor mentioned that Marrero had experienced some personal difficulties the previous fall. Tension at home. A pair of unannounced missed shifts. The deputies documented it and filed it. Classified as probable voluntary absence. An adult male who had chosen to walk away from a difficult home situation. No state alert, no state police notification, no federal missing persons flag, no active investigation. The drilling company hired a replacement within the week. By the start of week 2, they had stopped returning Claudia Marrero's calls entirely. What the deputies didn't know, because the one person who held that information was not talking to anyone in law enforcement, the drilling company's owner had received a ransom note on March 21st. Not the family. Not law enforcement, the owner. It arrived by encrypted messaging application. No sender identity, no traceable routing, with a single photograph attached. Marrero, holding a handwritten date card reading March 20th. Behind him, a concrete wall, a battery lantern mounted on a bracket, no windows. A copy of the Midland Reporter telegram folded to show the front page. The demand. $1.4 million in untraceable cash. Delivery location to follow within 14 days. Failure to pay meant no worker. The owner did not call the FBI. He did not contact the sheriff. He called a private attorney that afternoon, then his insurance broker. His kidnap and ransom policy carried a $2 million ceiling. The demand came in below his coverage limit. The attorney reviewed the policy language and outlined his client's options. What the owner chose next is the subject of an ongoing federal grand jury proceeding in Pecos, Texas, as of late April 2026. No final disposition has been announced. He paid nothing. He reported nothing. The legal reasoning, reconstructed later from communications produced under federal subpoena, engaging with the kidnappers would have triggered mandatory law enforcement notification under the policy terms, and a federal investigation into his drilling operations would have exposed permit irregularities, unpaid state environmental fees, and a multi-year pattern of equipment certification fraud his company had been quietly managing. A missing contract employee was a contained problem. A federal audit was not. On April 5th, 17 days after the first message arrived, a second encrypted communication reached the owner's phone. Another photograph. Marrero, visibly thinner, holding a date marker. April 4th. No new deadline. No revised demand. Just proof of life, transmitted to a man who had chosen not to act on the original. One detail that stuck with me when I read through the federal complaint. The owner's call log for that morning shows he opened the second photograph at 9:47 a.m. His next outgoing call, placed 3 minutes later, was to his golf club to confirm a Saturday tee time. No calls to law enforcement appear anywhere in his log between March 21st and April 23rd. If you're finding this case as unsettling as we do, hit like now. The next section explains how a man sat in a buried tank for 5 weeks while the formal systems around him produced exactly nothing. Like CTA, before the hardest section, the failure of multiple institutions simultaneously. The crew that operated the compound had not improvised this operation. They had refined it. Their first kidnap for ransom in West Texas ran in January 2025. The target, an independent oil equipment broker in Odessa, who moved high-value drill pipe on consignment and kept significant business liquidity in cash. He was held for 11 days. His family paid $800,000. He was released on a dirt road outside Van Horn and explicitly warned what would follow a law enforcement report. No federal case was ever opened. No sheriff's report was filed beyond an initial wellness check. Their second operation ran in September 2025. A ranch manager in Brewster County who administered payroll for a large agricultural operation. 22 days in captivity. Ransom demand, $900,000. Paid. Released. Same warning. Same result. 2 operations. 2 successful extractions. No federal exposure. The crew had figured out something real about West Texas operators. K&R insurance was common, federal scrutiny was universally feared, and the basin's culture strongly discouraged bringing outside agencies into private business matters. They were not cartel-affiliated. They were not involved in trafficking. They were 3 men who had recognized a specific structural vulnerability: the intersection of private insurance, institutional reticence, and thin rural law enforcement coverage, and had profited from it twice before deciding to go a third time. They spent nearly a month watching the drilling company's shift rotation before selecting Marrero. Their criteria, deduced from the ledger entries later recovered in the compound, appeared to be straightforward: employers carrying identifiable K&R coverage, workers whose family circumstances limited their access to institutional advocacy, and operations located far enough from major population centers to restrict the family's ability to generate media or political pressure. Marrero checked every box. They took him at the truck stop on the evening of March 18th. 2 vehicles. The entire operation at the truck stop lasted under 2 minutes. By midnight, they were 80 miles into the backcountry. The compound itself was not improvised. An abandoned ranching lease, 1,700 acres, purchased through a Shell LLC registered 3 years prior. The main structure was a converted equipment outbuilding, reinforced concrete masonry block, corrugated steel roof. the kind of building that reads from surveillance satellite imagery as a generic storage shed on a dead grazing tract. Razor wire perimeter strung low along the fence line to avoid casting a distinctive overhead shadow profile. An off-grid solar array positioned in a ravine on the property's western edge, tucked below the ridgeline that shielded it from aerial view. 2 satellite signal jammers, commercial fleet tracking suppression units, the kind sold to prevent unauthorized GPS monitoring of company vehicles, positioned at opposite ends of the compound to create a complete radio frequency dead zone over the entire property footprint. The buried tank sat 30 meters north of the main building. An agricultural steel water cistern, 8 feet in diameter, sunk 6 feet into the hard pan and covered with a welded access hatch and 30 inches of fill, ventilated by a single 3-inch pipe capped with a mesh screen. From the air, indistinguishable from any cistern on any working ranch in that corridor. And in a cinder block annex attached to the east wall of the main building, 740 blasting detonators, ATF classified controlled items, stolen from a mining contractor in Eddy County, New Mexico in November 2025. They were not part of the kidnapping operation. They were inventory, awaiting cartel-affiliated buyers across the border who needed precisely timed initiators for tunnel construction and structural demolition work, and had no access to the legitimate procurement chain. The kidnapping and the detonator trade were separate revenue streams, running from the same address. Marrero was in a buried tank 12 meters from a cache of stolen military-grade explosive initiators. Retention. Checkpoint. 40 o'clock, Stakes Bend. Compound is a multi-crime site. Formal systems have produced nothing. What breaks it open? The first anomaly arrived on April 8th. A CBP drone running a nighttime smuggling detection sweep over the Brewster County backcountry flagged a thermal signature during its southern pass. A heat plume, consistent with a running generator, on a parcel carrying no registered power service, no active agricultural operations, and no permit applications on file. The drone's automated classification system tagged it as a possible mobile narcotics processing setup, a standard enough finding in that corridor, and routed the report to a DEA analyst in El Paso who had 11 other active cases. He flagged it for follow-up and moved on. The report sat in an interagency shared folder for 11 days. An ATF intelligence analyst accessed that folder on April 19th. She had been building a movement map for the 740 stolen detonators from the Eddy County theft since the previous December, cross-referencing anomalous procurement activity, satellite imagery of properties with no registered operations, and transport permit applications that might indicate the units were being staged for southbound transfer. The CBP drone report's coordinates fell within the geographic corridor her map was tracking. She pulled the parcel registration. Shell LLC, incorporated 3 years prior. Clean formation documents. Too clean, she noted, for a parcel that had no registered income, no utility service, and no apparent use. She ran the pre-LLC title chain. The land had previously been part of a larger agricultural holding that used a mining contractor out of Carlsbad, New Mexico for road grading work. Carlsbad, New Mexico, Eddy County, same county as the detonator theft. Not confirmation, not probable cause, but enough to request a second drone pass to confirm whether the thermal signature was persistent or transient. She filed the request on April 20th. CBP scheduled the pass for April 22nd. That pass returned 2 additional readings. The generator plume was still active, and a vehicle thermal signature in a covered equipment bay matched the profile of a late-model diesel pickup that had been logged in connection with the Eddy County theft. She had begun drafting a federal warrant application when a separate case file arrived from the FBI's Midland Satellite Office, flagged for potential geographic overlap with the detonator investigation because the property boundary in her draft warrant corresponded to coordinates contained in a GPS log submitted by a civilian. The civilian was Claudia Marrero. I went through the account the FBI agent recorded from his April 2nd meeting with her, And what's most striking isn't that she had evidence. It's that she had more useful, organized evidence than the sheriff's department had produced in 15 days of writing her off as a voluntary absence. She had found the GPS system herself. Company-issued safety equipment for Permian Basin rig workers had, over the preceding 3 years, increasingly incorporated asset tracking tags, GPS units designed not for worker safety, but for equipment inventory management. Hard hats, tongs, measurement tools, all tracked to prevent equipment loss. Marrero's employer had fitted his hard hat with a rig safety tag at the start of the previous calendar year. When he disappeared, the tag remained powered and continued transmitting location data to the company's asset management server at 4-hour intervals. The company had never shared this data with the sheriff's department. Nobody had asked. Claudia Marrero had asked, of herself. She had found the company's asset tracking portal by reading the onboarding manual from her husband's first week, a document he'd brought home and filed in their household records. She logged in using his credentials, saved on their shared laptop, and pulled the full location history for his tag number. 3 pings stood out. The truck stop on the evening of March 18th, a reading 42 miles southeast, 6 hours later, and a final ping on March 23rd, coordinates in the Brewster County backcountry, roughly a quarter mile from the boundary of an abandoned ranching lease. Then the tag went dark. The jammer had terminated the signal, but not before placing Marrero's hard hat, and, by extension Marrero, within a quarter mile of the compound that 2 federal investigations were independently examining from different angles. She had brought the printed GPS log to the FBI satellite office in Midland on April 2nd, along with her 11 sheriff's reports, a timeline she had built herself, and a map of her husband's route, annotated with the signal pings. The FBI agent she met with had no active missing persons investigation to attach it to. What he did have was a woman with a self-constructed investigative file that pointed to a specific set of coordinates in Brewster County, 3 weeks before those same coordinates would appear in an ATF warrant draft. His report, forwarded to the Midland field office on April 4th, contained those coordinates. They appeared in the interagency case file on April 21st. Subscribe now, because what happened in the 18 hours between that case file and the breach, as 2 independent federal investigations merged into a single tactical operation, produced findings that went well beyond one missing man. Retention, checkpoint, 50% mid-roll hook, 2 cases merged into one, staging out of Marathon. What's inside that compound besides Marrero? Here's what this case tells us about where the gaps actually are. Diego Marrero sat in a buried steel tank for 36 days, while the person with the most useful information, his employer, managed his insurance exposure instead of making a phone call. The formal system that should have triggered a federal response produced 11 ignored incident reports and a voluntary absence classification. What broke it open was a woman who read an employee manual, found a GPS portal, printed a map, and drove to the FBI herself. That's not a system working. That's one person with enough persistence and enough luck to find the right portal before she ran out of time. For 31 days, the institutional failures ran alongside her persistence. Most families don't know to check GPS asset tags. Most employers don't have attorneys who tell them exactly what this one was told. The 2 things had to collide at precisely the right moment. On April 21st, a conference call between the ATF analyst, the FBI's Midland agent, the FBI's San Antonio field office, and the ATF's Dallas division authorized a joint task force. The next day, 12 FBI tactical personnel and 6 ATF special response operators were staging at a livestock auction facility south of Marathon, the nearest covered facility that couldn't be observed from the compound's ridgeline. The satellite jammers presented the primary tactical obstacle. No radio relay, no electronic surveillance, no communication with any asset inside the perimeter once the team entered the jammer's effective range. Obstacle Hashkar 1 and Solution. Jammers blocked electronic approach. Solution was to exploit the reboot cycle. The ATF tech team had a partial solution. A directional radio frequency pulse emitter, truck-mounted, capable of overwhelming the jammer's frequency at close range and creating a 30 to 40 second reboot window. The problem: the truck required an approach within 300 meters of the compound to be effective. The terrain offered no covered approach within 500. The last 300 meters was open hardpan, visible from the building in any direction under night vision conditions. Put yourself in the team leader's position for a moment. You have one electronic window. It lasts 30 to 40 seconds. 740 stolen blasting detonators are stored in an annex 30 feet from your entry point. And if anyone inside that building sees your truck approaching on night vision, you lose the window before you've taken a single step inside the wire. There was no clean solution. What the team chose was slower and colder and less elegant than a truck-mounted pulse emitter. At 2:48 a.m. on April 23rd, a surveillance drone at the outer edge of the jammer's rated effective range was used to deliberately trigger the unit's active suppression mode. The jammer responded, full power broadcast, then automatic reboot. 16 minutes of reduced output while it recalibrated. The approach team used that window, moved on foot, 800 meters in 14 minutes, reaching a dry wash 220 meters from the compound perimeter at 4:03 a.m. They lay down on the desert floor in 41-degree cold and waited 8 minutes for the jammer to return to full power. Then, at 4:09 a.m., they triggered the reboot cycle a second time. When the window opened, they moved. The assault began at 4:11 a.m. 3 simultaneous elements. The front gate perimeter, cut with hydraulic shears. No spark generation near the detonator cache. No noise signature that would carry to the building. The main building east wall door, breached with a mechanical ram. The buried tank, located from the drone's thermal map, and approached by a 2-agent team with a battery-powered angle grinder, while a third held the perimeter. One captor was on a cot inside the main building. He did not resist. A second was in a sleeping bag on the equipment bay floor. He reached toward a rifle against the wall. He did not reach it. The third man was outside the wire running a foot circuit of the fence line, a predictable routine that had become a tactical liability. He was secured from behind at 4:12 a.m. The buried tank hatch was opened at 4:14 a.m. Marrero was inside, chained at the ankle to a welded ring on the tank floor. He had a sleeping bag, a battery lantern, a 40-gallon plastic drum of water, and 4 days' worth of packaged food in a storage tub beside him. He had been in that space for 36 days. He was alive, gaunt, dehydrated. His ankle was abraded and swollen at the chain contact point. He was conscious and responsive. The first thing he said to the ATF medic who came through the hatch was his wife's name. The second was his children's ages. He was assessed on scene and transferred to Big Bend Regional Medical Center in Alpine before 5 a.m. Claudia Marrero received the notification call at 5:17 a.m. She had been awake. The detonator annex yielded the full inventory: 740 blasting initiators in factory transit cases, with handwritten Spanish shipping annotations indicating at least 2 separate batch preparations. Alongside them, 2 stolen bolt-action rifles with obliterated serial numbers, a satellite phone with 11 stored contacts across 4 domestic area codes, and a spiral-bound notebook written in a mixture of English and Spanish. Federal prosecutors described it in their initial filings as a target ledger. 6 entries. The Odessa equipment broker from January 2025. The Presidio County ranch manager from September 2025. Diego Marrero, and 3 additional targets, with full names, financial profiles, physical surveillance notes, and shift pattern documentation, who had not yet been acted on. 2 were Permian Basin drilling operators. 1 managed logistics for an Eagle Ford shale extraction company. All three were notified by FBI within 48 hours of the arrest. What's striking about this case isn't the compound or the detonators. It's what the ledger shows about the logic behind the operation. 3 prior and planned targets. None of the prior victims had filed federal reports. The crew hadn't gotten lucky. They had correctly modeled the information vacuum. K&R insurance, operator culture, limited rural law enforcement capacity, and had confirmed that model twice before March 18th. They were on their 3rd confirmation. They were not done. Is this model going to appear again in other resource extraction corridors over the next 5 years? Comment yes or no below, because the answer depends on whether the systems that created the vacuum get addressed, and right now, there's no indication they are. The 3 men identified in federal filings as Ruben Escarcega, 41, Tomas Villanueva, 37, and Marcus Drell, 44, were charged in federal district court in Pecos on April 25th. Escarcega and Villanueva faced kidnapping, conspiracy, unlawful restraint, and federal weapons charges. Drell, the only U.S. citizen among the 3, carried additional counts tied to the detonator theft receipt and brokering chain, which prosecutors alleged he had facilitated from the U.S. side of the border. All 3 were held without bail. Unpopular opinion, and we'll put our name on it. When an employer receives a ransom communication about a captive employee, views a proof-of-life photograph 17 days later, makes no law enforcement contact over 36 days, and that employee survives only because actions entirely outside the employer's conduct created an accidental investigative convergence, that is a choice that should carry criminal exposure. Not a fine, not a civil settlement, a criminal charge. The argument that attorney-client privilege and insurance policy language made the non-report a gray area is the same argument used in every corporate liability case that ends in a plea deal and no one serving time. The federal grand jury in Pecos will decide whether that gray area is actually gray. As of late April 2026, it had not. The satellite phone's 11 contacts produced 4 individuals with traceable domestic addresses who were taken into federal custody within a week of the arrest. The detonator investigation was running in parallel with the kidnapping prosecution. Whether any portion of the 740 initiators had been pre-positioned for transfer before the breach remained, as of the last public filing, unconfirmed. The shipping annotations in the transit cases suggested at minimum 2 batches had been prepared for movement. Retention. Checkpoint. Last 60s payoff plus open loop. Crew in custody. Compound dismantled. Detonators and ledger seized. And the conditions that produced this remain unchanged. Diego Marrero was discharged from Big Bend Regional after 4 days. He returned to Midland. His wife had rented a smaller apartment during the 5 weeks he was gone. She'd burned through most of their savings on 2 private investigators and fuel costs running between Midland, Pecos, and Alpine, trying to generate leads. She'd contacted 2 journalists and a state representative's office in the final week before the breach, pushing for a formal missing persons reclassification. The journalists hadn't published anything. The representative's office never responded. She got the call at 5:17 a.m. on April 23rd. Her husband was alive. She had been awake for several hours. The compound is dismantled. The 3 men are in custody. The detonators that remained on site are in federal evidence storage. The calculation that made the compound possible, that West Texas operators with K&R coverage and compliance exposure would not report ransom contacts, that rural sheriff's departments would classify missing workers as voluntary absences without investigation, that the resulting information vacuum would hold long enough for the operation to succeed. That calculation is not in custody. It was correct twice before it ran into an ATF analyst, cross-referencing the wrong-looking thermal plume in the right place at the right time, and a woman who knew her husband well enough to know he didn't just walk away. The ledger had 3 more names in it. If you want to know what happens in the corridors those names came from, subscribe. We'll be here when the next case surfaces. And in West Texas, based on what this compound contained,